They once lived under Daesh's brutal reign. Now thousands of Iraqis could be heading to a mass detention camp. Is it for their own safety, or do they themselves pose a threat? I'm Imran Garta, and today's Newsmaker is Iraq's repatriation plan. Daesh is one of the most savage terror groups to have existed in recent years. They murdered, raped and tortured in their efforts to create a so-called caliphate across Iraq and Syria. They've now lost all their former territory. But what happens to the hundreds of thousands that lived under their rule? Baghdad has a plan: detain them all in internment camps. Human Rights Watch says that proposal violates international law, but Iraq's government cites security concerns and says it's for the safety of their own citizens. Humanitarian groups don't agree. They say by isolating the families of Daesh fighters, Iraq risks further radicalizing an entire generation. Denise Savoya has more.
Yusuf is a widow raising 4 children. Her husband was a law enforcement official for Daesh until he was killed in an airstrike 2 years ago.
When he pledged allegiance to ISIS, the liberation of East Mosul had already started. But the circumstances were so bad that he couldn't take it anymore. Living conditions were worse than impossible.
She and her children are still haunted by his legacy.
The whole family is destroyed, deprived of everything.
Sometimes when we go to sell the bread in the mosque, some people disgrace me by saying that my father was Daesh. I swear to God, this is so painful to me. They're talking about my father and it makes me feel sad. It hurts me.
As Daesh lost its foothold in Iraq, thousands of people living under its self-proclaimed caliphate followed the group into Syria. Now that it's been defeated, they've been left languishing in camps controlled by the US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces. Iraqis make up about 40% of the population at the Al-Hol refugee camp in northeast Syria. The government in Baghdad has spent months negotiating for the return of about 30,000 people. But they could end up swapping one camp for another. According to the Washington Post, Iraqi officials want to isolate them in detention camps. Partly because of security concerns, and partly because they're at risk of violent retribution from neighbours displaced by Daesh. Even those already back in Iraq face isolation and exclusion.
They call us Daeshi families. They don't give us identification cards. Our children are unable to go to school, and they are fighting us. On what basis are these children being punished for their father's sins?
Children born under Daesh's so-called caliphate were rarely registered with Iraqi authorities. Now, about 45,000 children have no identification documents.
Therefore, they cannot register in school. They cannot go to the hospital or have any kind of health care. They cannot get vaccination, and they cannot receive any kind of assistance from their government, such as food distribution. Basically, today they don't exist in their country.
Tom Perry Costa from the Norwegian Refugee Council says Iraq risks alienating an entire generation.
By punishing entire families, you marginalize them and you seriously undermine reconciliation efforts in Iraq. You cannot hold accountable children for the crime of their parents. You cannot hold accountable a widow because her husband took the wrong path.
If they are ignored, what are they going to give back to Iraq? What kind of future will Iraq have? Can we expect any kind of future for Iraq? These children will become aggressive, bloodthirsty and savage. Am I right or not?
And a radicalised generation is the last thing Iraq needs as it tries to rehabilitate its people and rebuild the country. Denise Savoya, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now in studio is Jasmine El-Gamal. She's a former Middle East policy advisor for the U.S. Department of Defense and is now a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. In Baghdad is Ahmed Rushdi. He's the foreign policy advisor to the Speaker of the Iraqi Parliament. And in London is Bilqis Vella. She's a Human Rights Watch senior Iraq researcher. I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers. Jasmine, let's start with you. Detaining and quarantining families of Daesh or people suspected of being connected to Daesh. It's a bad idea, isn't it?
It is. It's a very bad idea for so many reasons. Partly because it involves children, partly because it involves women who have not been given the chance to prove their guilt or innocence. You know, you're just rounding up a bunch of families and putting them in essentially what are prison conditions and kind of hoping for the best. Absolutely not a good idea.
Ahmed Rushdi, what's going on? Why this extraordinary measure where they're calling for Iraqis to return from across the border from Syria, but also those Iraqis who lived under Daesh, the possibility of more than 250,000 people going into detainment or detention camps? This is horrible, isn't it? It's clearly going to make things worse. So why is the government pushing for it?
Well, it looks like it's you are detaining people, just people. They are not warriors. So at the end, you are actually making an army. Children with 11, 12 years old, after 10 years, how they gonna behave? All those things, all those humanitarian issues should be managed. All those social issues should be managed. I don't think Iraq has the capability to manage all those humanitarian, social issues. Even economically speaking, you are talking about 30,000 people, so food, water, supplies, and so on. How are you going to manage all those things? That means you need a budget for that. So Iraq should get all the blame about those people. I don't think it's correct. I think the UN should take the advantage of this issue. The UN should make monitoring for all those camps, and I think it's an international issue. It's not only Iraqi
but
issue.
The Iraqis are saying,
I don't think the international community should put all the blames on the Iraqi shoulders.
Okay, but the Iraqis are making this decision for themselves. You have your implementation and follow-up National Reconciliation Committee, and you have them deciding that this is the best way forward. And they're admitting to human rights groups, such as Human Rights Watch, who we'll hear from, that this includes siblings, children, spouses, parents of alleged Daesh members, right? So nobody's been charged with a crime. So Iraq is actually taking the initiative here. Why should the international community get involved here? Why don't the Iraqis sort themselves out?
I'm not saying it's easy to integrate those people with the people of Mosul, with the people of Salahuddin, with people of Diyala, with people of Anbar. No one will accept them, for sure. All the people there seeing them as not only warriors, that they are the cause of destroying their houses, destroying their cities. Now, it's a problem, yes, but I think it should be an international effort. By the way, if the Iraqi government accepted that, let's see what the parliament, what's going to do. The parliament should accept something like that. Let's see what's going to happen. But at the end, it's not an only Iraqi issue. Iraq should not involved only on this issue. But it should be an international issue.
Okay, but Ahmed, isn't it easier for the Iraqi
solutions?
Sorry, Ahmed, sorry to interrupt you. Isn't it easier for the Iraqi government to convince their people in places like Mosul that these people are not your enemy? If you're a Mukhtar, you need to allow this family to be registered. If you're a young Iraqi person who suffered under Daesh, isn't it up to the authorities to tell them, don't take out your grievances against these people because they merely lived under Daesh or they might have just been connected to Daesh? Isn't there a responsibility to take the sting out of the hate by the government? Why should the international community do this?
No, you're absolutely right. It should be the government should do something like that. But tell me, what are the programs for something like that? Because there is no real programs for integration happening in the whole world. So why Iraq should do something like that, especially the liberated area only liberated before, let's say, 2 years, something like that. So the people actually didn't, let's say, forgot what happened at that time. And that's why I think the capability of the Iraqi government does not reach in a way that they can convince people first, and secondly, have the appropriate programs to make integration for those people, those families, with the families of those liberated areas. That's why I'm saying we need the help of the international community to say, okay, guys, you need programs, and those are the programs.
Okay, Bilqis Villa, is it true that the Iraqi government is incapable of reintegrating these people? That's why the easiest solution is to just stick them into one big camp?
So, I mean, as you rightly point out, there's an obligation on the side of the government to do what they need to reintegrate these families and do so safely. Maybe they come, and this is, you know, area-specific, family-specific. They might come from a neighborhood in Mosul where the neighbors are very angry and might not let them return home safely. In that case, the government can say to these families, we have a camp. It's supported by the international community. There are over a dozen of these camps still in Iraq with humanitarian presence, with international presence. And the authorities could say to families, you have the option of living there. If you do not feel safe going back to your neighborhood in Mosul, you can live in this camp nearby. We will not restrict your access to movement. You can come and go. You can get employment opportunities outside of the camp. You can enroll your children in school. And within the confines of this camp, we can ensure your security. Whereas if you return to Mosul, we're not sure that we can because, as was mentioned, hostilities ended not that long ago, and there is anger and grievance in the community, but that's non-coercive. That gives families agency and the choice for their own destiny. Some families might say, I prefer not to be in a camp, but I have relatives in Baghdad or in another part of the country, and there I could reintegrate on my own and set up my own structure and get my kids back into school and get myself working again. The problem with the government approach is that they are unilaterally deciding to remove any agency on the side of the families and to force them against their will into this situation.
Right. Jasmine Al-Gamal, I'm curious to hear what you think about what Gilles de Kerchove, the EU's counterterrorism coordinator, said at a conference in Rome. Gilles said, about 45,000 children born in Iraq but denied citizenship because they were in areas controlled by Daesh risk becoming the next generation of suicide bombers. This is the EU's anti-terrorism chief, right? There's this idea that these people are on the verge of just snapping into becoming suicide bombers and terrorists. Is that an exaggeration, and is that a part of the problem as well?
Look, I mean, I think that he's partly saying that to instill some urgency on the part of the international community to say, if we don't do something about this, this is going to turn into a real problem. So it might be a slight exaggeration. Of course, not every one of them is going to turn into a suicide bomber. But what he's trying to say, which is completely valid, is that this is an entire generation of children who are going to be put essentially into a prison, an open-air prison, denied any access to proper education, denied any access to psychosocial services, denied any access to any sort of semblance of a childhood, and we expect them to one day grow up and be normal people. It can't happen. But I want to say just one thing that I think is important to note, because I do agree with Ahmed that it's not fair to put all the blame or to put all of the expectations on the Iraqi government. The Iraqi government has actually done something that not many other governments have done, which is actually take responsibility for their own people, bringing them back from Syria into Iraq as a first step. They should be commended for that. That's what the European governments should be doing as well. They're not. But what happens from here is actually just as important. You can't just bring them back and put them into a camp. You have to bring them back. You have to ask for assistance from the international community to keep them alive and safe and healthy until the Iraqi government has the opportunity to do what you just said, which is extremely important, which is allow some time for the communities that have been so scarred by Daesh to grow used to the idea of accepting back some of these women and children into their communities. That's a long-term thing, at least a medium term, if not a long-term project. In the meantime, the Iraqi government does need help, and European governments should take back their citizens as well.
Ahmed Rushdi, we know how this plays out because it's played out in recent history in Iraq itself, where after we saw a lot of Sunnis being marginalized, a lot of people seeing their family members killed, young people were ripe pickings for extremist groups. Isn't the Iraqi government just creating the platform for this story to repeat itself again? You'll have a bunch of Sunnis who have a terrible life and they feel victimized by the majority. Cue a new group, a new ISIS, a new Al-Qaeda, to come in and say, we'll give you some dignity, come and fight for us. That's going to happen, isn't it?
Well, you're absolutely right. So all those things can happen. All those things that you said can happen and can happen openly. No one can monitor all those things. And if we are talking about long-term prison, that means that I will be inside the prison for all my life. I don't know actually what is my future. So, and I don't have education. I don't have a psychopath therapy and so on. All those things I don't have, and you need me to stay in the prison and not to go outside. And we are talking about 25,000. Maybe there will be marriages inside those prisons. That means it will be a number that it will be huge enough to say it's an army. At the end, again, I will say it's the responsibility of the international community to say, okay, guys, thank you very much. The Iraqi government accepted to put them let's say in a camp. Let us put some sort of let us make some sort of a success story about fighting terrorism ideologically, psychologically, and make those people as models of the new world, the free world. Is that we're giving them education, make them something for Iraq and for the whole world, make them an example. Right. And okay. Let us not forget, there is a legal issue, is that there are people who are not Iraqis, there are people from Europe. So maybe there will be some lawyers will sue the government, saying that why you are putting them in the prison and they are not Iraqis. So already there will be some sort of a media focus on them. So why we are not making some sort of a first shot for a solution for this problem and keep it on the hands of the Iraqi government, which is also at the end it's not completed. We all know that politically it's not completed. We all know that we have economical issues in Iraq, that the Iraqi government is suffering from economical issues, and that's why I said from the beginning, all those things need a budget. So from where? From Iraq or from the international community or from the UN, from the donations, from where?
Okay, understood. Bilqis, as your organization has pushed back and criticized the proposed policies, have you had much engagement with the Iraqi government? Are they listening to you?
So we've been engaging on this topic of what happens to these families specifically for over 2 years now. I have been discussing this with local tribal leaders, local authorities in the governorates, and of course the federal government. Unfortunately, policies by the government to sequester these families, to further marginalize them, to strip them of all their basic and fundamental rights as citizens by denying them access to civil documentation and free movement, employment, healthcare, etc. All of these policies have not changed in those last 2 years and in fact have become more draconian. Now, in light of this new proposal, we sent a letter with our concerns about the proposal to both the Prime Minister and to the President. We are hoping we receive a response to those letters, and really not just a formal response, but an opening to have dialogue with the government around really not only what international human rights law says, but what Iraqi law says, because Iraqi law is absolutely clear that this is fundamentally illegal. And judges, including senior judges that I spoke to within the High Judicial Council, they told me this proposal would easily be challenged in the Supreme Court in Iraq and should not move forward in their view.
Okay, so Ahmed, tell your friends and colleagues in Parliament to get in touch with Bilqis and Human Rights Watch because they want to talk, they want to work with you, and they want to sort this out. I want to finish up with Jasmine. Jasmine, is this story a microcosm of the bigger question of what happens after Daesh? Okay, you can defeat Daesh, you can smash them up, you can destroy their power structure, you can destroy their army on the ground, but afterwards, does anybody know what to do?
100%. This is absolutely a microcosm. This is a fundamental question about what Iraq looks like after Daesh, what Europe looks like after Daesh, what Syria looks like after Daesh, which makes it all the more incredible that not much thought has been put into this, either on the part of in European capitals or the Iraqi government. The idea is, you have thousands upon thousands of fighters, women and children who are locked into these camps in Syria and Iraq. The Europeans don't want to take them home. The Iraqis don't know what to do with them, so they're sequestering them into these camps. The Syrians certainly don't want them back. There is a critical need for governments to get together and figure out what this looks like, because jailing an entire generation of children with their mothers, putting a bunch of fighters in jail to become more and more radicalized, is the absolute worst possible thing we can do for everybody's security. Iraq, Syria, Europe, the entire international community has a responsibility to solve this, and they need to start thinking about it now.
Okay. Jasmine Ahmed and Bilqis, pleasure having you all on the Newsmakers. Thanks for joining us. Still to come, these Reuters journalists were jailed for more than a year. Myanmar's government has set them free. Is the country conceding it made a mistake? And the death toll from the DRC's Ebola outbreak rises above 1,000. What's being done to stop the rapid spread of the deadly virus? After more than 500 days behind bars, 2 Reuters journalists were among thousands released after a presidential amnesty. Walon and Kya So-u had been investigating the killing of 10 Rohingya Muslims during an army crackdown in Rakhine State. Myanmar's government sentenced the journalists to 7 years behind bars for violating the country's Official Secrets Act. And as Yola Abdafid reports, their jailing was seen as an assault on press freedom and democracy.
A long wait behind bars, but as Walon and Kya So-u were freed, it was a homecoming worth waiting for. Especially for Walon, as he met his infant daughter for the first time. His wife gave birth while he was in prison. They were released on Tuesday by a presidential amnesty. Their Reuters colleagues were delighted.
I would like to say thank you very much for everything. I'm really happy and excited to see my family and my colleagues. And I can't wait to go to my newsroom.
We are enormously pleased that Myanmar has released our courageous reporters, Walon and Kya So-u. Since their arrest 511 days ago, they have become symbols of the importance of press freedom around the world. We welcome their return.
In 2017, both journalists had been investigating the killing of 10 Rohingya Muslim men and boys in Rakhine State. They were arrested before publishing their report after being trapped by undercover police officers in a meeting set up by the authorities. The final Reuters report gathered testimonies from Buddhist villagers who confessed to killing Rohingya Muslims and torching their homes, and from Myanmar's paramilitary police, who directly implicated the military. The United Nations says the journalist release is a step towards improving press freedom and shows Myanmar's commitment to democracy. The UN estimates 730,000 Rohingya fled Myanmar to Bangladesh during the military crackdown. In April, Walon and Kya So-u and other Reuters journalists were awarded the Pulitzer Prize while behind bars and have become symbols of press freedom, giving hope for the future, according to one of the negotiators who secured the journalist release.
It opens up a new chapter, it opens up new opportunities for re-engagement and really pursue that dialogue, because everyone has an interest in addressing the issues in Rakhine, whether you are within Myanmar or you are outside Myanmar.
The journalist's case eventually led to 7 soldiers being sentenced to serve 10 years hard labor for contributing and participating in murder. So is the government's pardon an acknowledgement that the journalist's conviction was heavy-handed? And will it lead to further scrutiny of Myanmar and its fledgling democracy? Yolo Abdavid, the Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, let's go to our guests. In Yangon, I'm joined by Nyo Aung Myint. He was once the spokesman for Aung San Suu Kyi and is a former member of Myanmar's ruling National League for Democracy. In Frankfurt is Ronay San Luin. He's a human rights activist and the coordinator of the Free Rohingya Coalition. And Thomas Melia is the Washington director of PEN America, an advocacy group that called for the release of the Reuters journalists. I thank you all for joining us. Nyo Aung Myint, let me start with you. By their release via the presidential decree, is that an admission from Myanmar's government that these were bogus charges and that the 2 should not have been behind bars in the first place?
Well, it's at how you prescribe that situation. I think personally, I love the freedom of speech and I love the freedom of press. But that's a very good, accusation. But I think the government is that's what we call that, like a due process of the law, because of that's based on the National Security Act. But every country has it. Every country has one, and it depends on the different level of the react that what they thought that is that the wrongdoers. But of course, like when our country is look like kind of democratization process. So we are trying to get it to full democracy. But this time, that's going to be a lot of confusion, a lot of problem is also a lot of challenges.
Okay, a lot of confusion, a lot of problems, and would you say a lot of injustice along the way?
No, a lot of the challenges. Challenges.
Rone San Nguyen, they spent 500 days behind bars, or slightly more than 500 days, for exposing a story about what happened in Rakhine State, what happened with the Rohingya people, and the consensus from the outside seems to be that Myanmar's government was not too happy about it, so that's why they decided to punish them for it. What do you make of the fact that now they've been pardoned and released? What does that say?
First of all, I would like to say that they should be apologized by the government and the military, because they were innocent. And journalism is not a crime. They were doing their job in investigating the crime committed by the government and the military. And they should be given the compensation because they were behind the bar for more than 500 days. So the world know that they were innocent, So there is no press freedom in the country. The government, even the civilian government, the Nobel laureate is leading this government, They have proven that there is no press freedom. They were investigating the crime and they were arrested and they were behind the bar for more than 500 days. Then they were released. Because of the international pressure. Since late 2017, even the U.S. Secretary of the State and the Vice President and all the government leaders across the world were they're advocating for them for their release.
So let me ask Thomas Melia about that. Thomas, help me understand how much pressure there was and just how tough that process was to get people to listen to the plight of Walon and Kya Soe.
Well, Walon and Kya Soe were imprisoned for 511 days for accurately reporting on atrocities committed by the Burmese military. Let's be clear about that. No one disputes the substance of their reporting. And in fact, in the sham of a trial that led to their conviction, a police officer stood up and said that it was a setup, that they were arrested in a sting operation that was not based on any kind of fact. There was no real breach of security documents. So the facts of this case are clear. The fact that they got awarded just a month ago the Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting attests to the quality and the professionalism of their work. PEN America, the writers organization here in the United States, awarded them a year ago our Freedom to Write Award, which is given each year to a writer or writers imprisoned for their work. And it prompted us to have a year-long advocacy campaign on their behalf. We were joined in that by many others. And I would say that the Reuters organization from the top, from their editor-in-chief, Stephen Adler, on down, was very strong, very consistent and persistent in representing these two young men in court at every step of the way. The international civil society organizations, press freedom groups like ours, also raised the alarm and kept public attention on it. And government officials in the U.S. and elsewhere responded to that. So I think the international pressure clearly had an effect on this case.
In your own mint, and because of that pressure, there was an embarrassment to Myanmar's government and to Aung San Suu Kyi, and that's why it was a political decision, wasn't it?
I don't think because of due to that the legal process, because after a couple of days after that the Supreme Court rejected their appeal, And then because that's the practice in that the previous government, Wu Sing government, and then current Win government, because the government doesn't really want to interfere the judicial. That's a separation of power. So that's the way that the military accused and then also brought into the court, and then but the rest is that the judgment is done by the judicial system. So, but some points that a little bit confused me that there was the military investigated after it happened in the Indian village, and then they have been charged and prosecuted at 10 years in jail for the perpetrators.
Right.
So
but this was after the report came out. Yeah. This was after the report came out, right?
No, I think it's a parallel because the report came during the process of the indictment and after indictment. That's my understanding.
Ronai Sandwin, does this give you an indication that whatever the reasons might be, let's go with this idea that there's an embarrassment to Myanmar's government, they're feeling the pressure, and they feel as if, okay, they've got to give something back here. They can't just be in denial of what's going on in Rakhine State. What does this mean for the Rohingya people? Does this mean that there's a significant change possibly in policy?
No, I don't think so, because like there are now the fighting between and the Arakan army and the Burmese military going on since end of last year. And there are some Rakhine media who supported the Burmese military when the Rohingya were killed mercilessly in the northern Rakhine state. Now when they are covering the fighting between the Arakan army and the Burmese military, and now they are now sued by the Burmese government. The government is suing them for contacting with the Arakan army. They have been sued with the unlawful association act. So there is no anything developing. I don't see any positive toward the Rohingya, because they have been promising the international community and the Bangladesh government that they will bring back the Rohingya, more than a million Rohingya from Bangladesh, but there is no any practical step they have taken since the agreement they have made in early 2018. Recently also they have the meeting with the Bangladeshi delegation in Naypyidaw. There is no any other anything they have shown that they are going to do for the Rohingya. So far what they did is the reception center, like a concentration camp with the barbed wire at the border. So I don't see any positive for the Rohingya. We still need a lot of pressure from the international community and the government. And there is the sanction imposed by the US, Canada, and the EU government. These are not enough. These are just the very little sanction. There is a lot of pressure need to be have to be put by the international community.
Yeah, the UK Foreign Secretary is saying, I hope it can be the start of a new chapter in our relations with Myanmar if following this we can also have the same kind of openness about the issues in Rakhine province for the Rohingyas. Thomas, broadly speaking, with this initial judgment and other similar cases, there was this idea that Rakhine State is off limits. Officially, you're going to find it very hard to get the necessary permissions to go in as a filmmaker, as a journalist, as a writer, to go and document it in any way, shape or form. If you try and bend the rules a little bit and maybe go through Bangladesh or something, you're going to end up in jail and you're going to end up in trouble. The message to journalists was stay away or else you'll get in trouble. Does that message still stand?
I think journalists and other kinds of investigators or artists as well, filmmakers, documentarists, etc. I think they should also be very wary of traveling in Myanmar, in Rakhine State and other places, because the overall political climate, the climate of the judicial system, the way the military dominates politics and has the run of the place, all means that Myanmar's quest for a democratic governance is still a long way from the finish line. You know, the annual reports by Freedom House, the independent assessor of these kinds of things, shows that Myanmar is still a partly free country. They've had partly free elections. The civilians partly run the government. It's a country in transition, but the transition seems to have stalled. So the climate of political liberties, civil liberties, including for journalists to do their work, remains perilous, as this case has shown. As was said earlier, an apology would be in order, and also vacating this conviction, because a pardon does not necessarily mean exoneration in the legal system in Myanmar. It's a pardon. It's a gesture of mercy from the president that doesn't have any reference to the fact of whether they were guilty or innocent or imprisoned on trumped-up charges, as was the case here. Well, it's a good day for the families.
Right.
It's a good day for the families, and they're out and they can go back to work. It's still not a reflection of an improved political climate in the country.
Indeed. Great day for the families, and both have signaled their keenness to go straight back to work. Nyo Aung Myint, was that a fair and accurate assessment of your country right now?
I think as the observer of the political development, I think we need to fix it so many areas. Because, you know, under the 5 decades of the military rule, our country has been suffer a lot. Not only a Rohingya, but also Rakhine, Myanmar, you name it. And we're still fighting in the civil war and the armed, the conflicts in our country. The West, the democratic countries like the U.S., UK, and then EU should, bring the Myanmar back to the backtrack on the very democratic country, and then we are in the Southeast Asia. We got like a Thailand under the military rule, and then that our neighbors. So then the international pressures sometimes also make it more worse than perfect, because the country is facing a perfect storm, and then I don't think that this is 100% fully democratic like the U.S. or UK, because that's a Myanmar. Okay. But we should have the chance to beg to that the international community.
Okay, next time we'll have the discussion about whether the international pressure helps or harms Myanmar's democratization. I think that's for a bigger discussion, and we'll invite you back on the program to discuss that. But for the moment, let me thank all of you, Nyo Aung Myint, Ronai Sandwin, and Thomas Melia. Thanks again for joining us on the Newsmakers.
These 1,000 deaths, it is hundreds of families, hundreds of children. These deaths are really deaths that could have been prevented.
It's the second deadliest Ebola outbreak in modern history, already killing more than 1,000 people. 8 groups in the Democratic Republic of Congo say the situation is getting worse. In the past week, 27 cases were reported in a single day, the highest recorded since the start of the outbreak in 2018. A major obstacle in the fight against the deadly virus has been violence. The World Health Organization reported more than 119 attacks on health workers and their facilities. So, in the presence of security threats and the absence of resources, how can this killer virus be contained? Well, let's go to Geneva and speak to Tarek Yasarovic. He's a spokesman for the World Health Organization. Tarek, that's exactly the question. Attacks continue. It's getting worse. How do you actually tackle this?
Well, exactly. As you have said, the security has a major impact on the response to this Ebola outbreak. Every time there is a security incident, we are basically not able to go into community and provide services, which means that people who are infected with the virus do not receive care. They stay in a community infecting other people. Once we get back to that community, then we see a big increase in numbers because the virus was freely circulating in the community. So we need environment that will enable us to do our job, but we also need funding for that.
Okay, if that is possible, say tomorrow the guns go silent, all the attacks stop. What happens then? How quickly is it possible to contain the spread of Ebola?
Well, we have to understand that in this current outbreak, in half of locations where we had Ebola transmission, that transmission has stopped. So every time we were able to access communities, to engage communities in the way that they become owners of the response, it was possible. So what does it mean? It means that we have treatment centers that provide treatment to those who are infected, including new therapeutics. We have vaccination teams that freely go and offer vaccines to those who are considered at risk. We have teams who follow those who are considered at risk. So in the case they get symptoms, they are treated quickly and diagnosed first, then treated. We have teams that do safe burials in a community. And we know once the community is engaged, once community takes ownership of the response, we are able then to contain the virus, because at our disposal we have this time vaccine, we have therapeutics, we know vaccine is efficient, but again, if we don't have access and that lack of access is because of security, then none of these measures can be put in place.
The Lancet did some great research and it found that more than a third of people in the parts of Eastern Congo or Eastern DRC that were polled were suspicious of the whole thing. A lot of them believed that Ebola was made up, it didn't actually exist. There was some nefarious intent from those people who were trying to save them from Ebola. Kind of similar to what we saw in Pakistan with the polio vaccine, right? Different sociology, but something similar. How much more difficult does it make it for you guys to do your job, given that so many people are suspicious of the fact that this is actually a reality?
Well, this is a key issue, really. We have to understand that although this is 10th outbreak of Ebola in Democratic Republic of the Congo, it's the first time in this part of the country. So these people have not seen Ebola before. That's also an area with active conflict, where there's a mistrust between communities or between communities and authorities. And obviously there will be groups who will try to use the outbreak to promote their goals, whatever those goals could be. We need really to start from the beginning in every new location to explain what the virus is, to explain how it is being transmitted and what needs to be done. Obviously, there is always misinformation. Sometimes it is deliberate, sometimes it's not. But we really have to fight. So we use everything at our disposals. We have anthropologists on the ground. We have people whose job is to engage the community, to spread information. But we have to understand what are the grievances of the community. And there are big grievances in this region. This population is already traumatized by the conflict. So they tell us, well, look, we don't have a security. Why we would engage in a fight against Ebola? Or we don't have a strong health system. So why all of that just for one disease? So we really have to understand it and try to work with them and try to make sure that that they understand how bad it is, and also to understand that WHO will stay here beyond Ebola, that we will continue to help Democratic Republic of Congo in all aspects of strengthening the health system.
Okay, Tariq Yasarovic, great to have you back on the program. Let's say goodbye now to Tariq and bring in two new guests. In Goma, in the DRC, is Fidel Bafilemba. He's an independent research consultant and author of the book Congo Stories. And in Paris, we have Anne-Marie Pegg. She's the clinical lead for epidemic response and vaccination at Doctors Without Borders in France. Good to have you both on the show. Fidel, is that at the heart of it all, what Tariq said? Lack of trust on the ground from so many people, which is only making this worse?
Well, this is a community that has been suffering crisis and especially armed attack for 5 years now, with a huge, massive presence of UN organizations, on top of which you have the UN peacekeeping mission called MONUSCO. So these are people who have been patrolling and doing literally nothing in terms of engaging the combatants and bringing an end to the security issue. So in that regard, on top of that, you have the political situation landscape, which is not helping, quite helping the situation. President Joseph Kabila with the Electoral Commission, they literally sidelined the people in Beni and Butembo under the excuses of Ebola, while people were going to mosques and churches, going to schools and so forth. So I think all of this is culminating into building up mistrust from the people. But also, let's mention that, and as I have mentioned it before, that most of the NGOs, they have failed lamentably reaching out to the people. And I am sorry that even the approach that is being used, it's not that much effective, that it's being seen as Ebola becomes a business by individual peoples, by individual NGOs who are not trickling down the responsibility to community leaders as it should be required.
Okay.
So they can chime in.
Okay. Anne-Marie, given that we've seen so many health workers killed and wounded in trying to tackle Ebola in eastern DRC, has MSF taken note of that? Has it changed policy? Are they rolling back or are they still engaged? What's going on?
We are still engaged in North Kivu. It's been a number of years since we've been active in the region. We have been running projects in North Kivu and Ituri province for a number of years and continue to do so, and certainly have scaled up those efforts in response to the Ebola outbreak. It's true we're no longer involved in the actual treatment centers in Butembo and Katwa, where we were previously involved, but in other areas in North Kivu where we are working, we have attempted to put in place a more integrated approach. What has become clear and what has been alluded to by my two colleagues certainly is the fact that the approach has been very vertical and very focused on Ebola as a single disease, despite the fact that this is an area that has been historically suffering from numerous health challenges and weaknesses in the healthcare system. And what our approach, therefore, and perhaps it has been a little bit too late for us to learn this lesson, but here we are. That the healthcare system that already exists in an area, in the province, in the region, needs to be involved in this outbreak. It needs to be the place where cases are identified. The healthcare workers who are already active in the area and have earned the trust of the community need to be involved, and we need to support them, not the other way around. There needs to be an investment in the healthcare system, and investment in the healthcare system in terms of basic things like infection prevention and control and good clinical practices are actually going to go a long way, not only to reduce the spread of Ebola, but to reduce the spread of other communicable diseases and improve the health structure overall. So our approach has been much more of late to look at the existing healthcare system and look at how we can strengthen that in face of the Ebola epidemic, and how can the existing system better adapt to responding to the epidemic rather than a completely parallel approach.
Fidel, given that there's a terrible security situation coupled with the epidemic, is the central government incapable of stepping in and trying to do anything, and that's why we're seeing such chaos? Do they actually, can they do anything even if they wanted to?
Well, they could do much. It's mostly a question of political will. If the security situation has been worsening in Beni and around Beni, including Butembo, it's mainly due to the lack of political will, mainly. Though, yes, there can be parameters of people out from outside and so forth. But again, this is the Congolese government not really doing its job as it should. So let's hope that Tshisekedi, who just stepped in, maybe he can do something as he has promised. But yes, I do agree with MSF that handing down the responsibility to the local communities, the existing structures, that's the way to go. Otherwise, people will remain suspicious because we have seen this number of huge NGOs and it doesn't make it, it doesn't help anything. Hand down to the people, sensitize those people, train them, and let do the job they can do because they're going to be more trusted than you guys.
Right. Anne-Marie, let me ask you about our ability collectively to tackle Ebola itself compared to that period 2013 to 2016. It was horrible in Liberia, Sierra Leone, in Guinea. Are we much better equipped medically, scientifically, in terms of vaccinations, in terms of treatment? If all things being equal, and if the security situation was okay, are we really much better equipped at tackling Ebola?
I think we are. I think we learned a lot of lessons out of the West Africa epidemic. That epidemic also spurred a lot of research and developments within the scientific community. And I think that's something that can definitely be seen as a positive development. There are therapeutic agents that are showing promise. There's a vaccination that also shows a good level of efficacy. There's been a lot of advancements in terms of providing a greater level of supportive care to patients who are sick in an ICU level setting. We've made great strides in being able to provide that level of care. So I think there are a lot of things from a medical scientific perspective that are very promising. And we also know that for people who arrive in the treatment centers early in the course of their illness and who do receive this level of care, the outcomes for them tend to be better than what we've seen in other epidemics. So absolutely, things are moving in a good direction from a medical scientific perspective. Of course, the challenge of that is if nobody arrives in the center that's providing the care, then there isn't really a lot of good that's coming out of these developments. And so, you know, as has been stated a number of times, a lot of the efforts that need to move forward now are those that allow a level of trust to be developed within the community, that people do arrive early and do benefit from these new therapeutic developments.
Right. Well, it's a worrying situation at the moment, but we wish the aid workers and the people on the ground and everybody involved all the best in trying to stem the tide here. For the moment, let me thank all of you, Fidel Bafilemba and Anne-Marie Pegg. I thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. And that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garza. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, lawmakers in the U.S. state of Florida now have a new way to combat school shootings. They give the teachers guns. We'll debate whether or not that's the best idea. Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.